Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Have you been cooperating internationally? Well, we maybe should all improve our international cooperation a bit. So today we've come to an expert. We're going to talk with Michael Simpson, who is the Executive Director of the British Columbia Council for International Cooperation. And the main thing they are doing these days, as I understand it, bless their hearts, is working on the Sustainable Development Goals. And you can't beat that. One of the things that Michael and I want to talk about is the way a number of our potential disasters are interlinked, and so that to deal with any one of them, you have to deal with all of the others or some of the others, and how that makes it possible for us to arrive at fixes that we might not be able to have otherwise, because we can solve a whole bunch of problems at once. I take such comfort from that. And I also take a little pleasure in talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, because as Project Save the World has 6 global threats that we try to address. And sometimes people say, well, you're really overdoing it, aren't you? You can't do that many things. And I say, yeah, well, look at the Sustainable Development Goals. They've got 17, right? So we're going to solve all 17 global threats today, right? Good. Hi, Michael. How are you? Michael
Good.
Simpson.
How are you, Meta?
Good.
We should be able to get it all solved in about an hour if we're good.
Well,
Yeah.
it shouldn't take any time for us to solve 17 global threats, right? No problem at all. And you started for a number of years as a filmmaker.
Yeah, many years ago, when I in my 20s and 30s, I made films only on environment, human rights, and development. And then eventually I started to work because I used what was called a participatory filmmaking process. So you got kind of involved in the actual films instead
Oh,
of
you
just.
mean you'd jump in front of your own camera?
No, I never did that, but I did jump into lots of situations, and a lot of those situations that I was working on had to do with, wars in Central America, or some of the conditions and issues that happened in different parts of the world around conflict and peace. Actually, that was a major part of what I did in environmental sustainability, and eventually, because of that, I started to get more and more involved with non-governmental organizations and sat on boards and so on. And eventually, I just decided, one day, after being in West Africa during the war in Sierra Leone, actually, I decided that I wanted to work with NGO. So I started an NGO, and then I worked with that NGO for a long time called One Sky. And then eventually, when I moved to Vancouver, I started working with the British Columbia Council for International Cooperation, which is a network of non-governmental organizations.
Mm-hmm.
So there's about 8
Let's
of those.
talk
There's
about
8
that,
networks.
because I think there are a number of them in Canada. Are they all Canadian and they're all somehow tied together?
Yes, basically, there are what are called 8 provincial and regional councils. So there's one in Ontario and Quebec and so on, right? And there's 8 of them. And then there's also, and they're bound together in what we call the Inter-Council Network, which is a council of councils, if you can think of it that way. And there's also actually a national council. It used to be called the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. It's now actually just simply called Cooperation Canada. And I sit on the board of Cooperation Canada as well.
Yeah.
And then the other board I sit on, which is kind of related in some ways to sustainability, is, of course, the Canadian Environmental Network. So I'm kind of a network guy. Think of me as a network guy. I'm really into networks because networks actually tackle that very thing you talked about in your
Well, now
introduction.
these local provincial networks, do you have autonomy, or do you coordinate exactly what you're going to be working on?
No,
so you're all working on the same issues.
no, we all have autonomy because I think in each region you see these regional ways of doing things. And people kind of specialize or focus in each of the regions on the things that are of interest to their members. Exactly.
What are some of the local BC issues? I can gather that probably forestry and fishing, right?
Yeah, but I will say the one thing that does bind us, that makes all the councils come together, is that we are actually all focused on international cooperation. So many of the groups are working overseas.
Okay, so they're not just local, and
no.
you, in fact, you don't do local.
Well, this is where it gets complicated because, in actual fact, international cooperation had a long history that comes out of the 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s. But if you look at what happened with the Sustainable Development Goals, It's the first time that people have said on our planet that some of the issues that we face have what they call a universal character, meaning they're showing up everywhere. So if you think of poverty, for example, for many, many people, we think of poverty as something that takes place in sub-Saharan Africa or in a refugee camp in a fragile state. But if you actually look at Canada, you can find some statistics if you disaggregate the data and you look into certain places and certain situations. You can find statistics where poverty is absolutely present in Canada and in some very dire situations. So when we looked at when the Sustainable Development Goals came along in 2015, people did a reset internationally and they realized that many of the problems that we face, the roots of them are actually universal. So Canada is one of the highest consumers of energy on the planet. And so where's the problem? If you're in Africa and you're trying to get access to energy and you have no access to energy, is it possible that maybe rich countries and rich people who have sort of exorbitant access to energy are actually using up the planet's supply? So that's where we get into these issues of climate justice and all of these things. It's a new way of thinking. As of 2015, the world has fundamentally changed in terms of how we feel we are as a community, because it's become much more global.
Why 2015?
If you go before 2015, you have the period where we were trying to do the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the focus of the MDGs, there was 8 of them. The idea there, or if you wanted to go even earlier to Agenda 21, to the 1990s, when we all met in Brazil and we set up the agenda for the 21st century, and there was a certain number of things we wanted to solve to make the world a better place. Most of those things were aimed at what we call the developing world. Back then, we would call it the developing world. And this is the idea that there had been a disparity since World War II between countries that had quite a bit of access to modernity and countries that were challenged in that respect. But what we've discovered, or what we understand now about the world, is that just because you're ahead economically does not mean that you're ahead morally or that you're ahead in so many other ways. Mm-hmm. And so what happened in 2015 was it was the first time that the agenda that the United Nations would set for the world was actually distributed. Everybody said, let's do this. The MDGs were written by 10 men in a room. The SDGs were actually written by thousands and thousands of people who brought forward what they felt were the most important issues. Mm-hmm. And ironically, that's actually why you have such a long list, because if you do go out and ask everybody, what are the problems that you're facing, you get a very long list. And so 17 was the minimum list. Mm-hmm. There's actually 169 sub-targets of all of the things that if you ask people in every part of the world that they care about. So it's what's interesting actually is, I looked a little bit at what your focus is and what Save the World is really interested in. And it is interesting to look back at the history of where did some of the issues, the pressing issues of the 1980s, nuclear war, for example, where did it go in terms of the trajectory? And if you look, it actually goes off the map in around 1992. Because but it's come back. This is the interesting thing, is it's come back to haunt us, because we saw the world in the 1990s as people wanted to move into the environmental sustainability issues, and so Rio was all about that, and Agenda 21 was all about that.
Prior to also the people felt that the Cold War was over, exactly, and that was we'd handled that. Looks like Gorbachev and Reagan had taken care of it, and many people still think so.
Well, there's people today that don't remember that era. There was 35,000 nuclear warheads that were pointed at each other on the planet, and there was
at one point 60,000.
60. Well, there you go.
That's the day that I got alarmed. It was after the 3 Mile Island thing, and I had the notion I'm going to be on the lookout for the cause of my life because I need to. And then somebody said, there's I would have guessed at that point that there might be 10 or 20 on the planet.
Yeah.
Somebody told me there were 60,000.
Yeah. What's sad is that we still have the capacity.
And we have
incinerate
several, like 5, 10, less than 10,000, I think now. But
yeah. But you don't need that many. That's the interesting thing, is today's weaponry is we don't need 35 or 60,000. You can blow up the world many times over and cause a nuclear winter very, very quickly.
But I think one of the important things is not just the fact that they're so damn dangerous, but that we're diverting resources away from the things that we do need to deal with in order to pay for these wretched things. And they
Yeah.
make us less safe rather than safer. So from my point of view, I'm very enthusiastic, or when now and then I get enthusiastic about the Green New Deal.
Hmm.
It covers a lot,
Hmm.
but they don't cover militarism. Did you notice that? They don't
Hmm.
talk about reducing military expenditures or even cutting down the risks caused by these miserable weapons, all kinds of miserable
Yeah.
weapons. So I think that we could take the Green New Deal and inject a few more little points, and it would become really important, because I think that the problem of weapons is, here I'm giving the talk. You're supposed to.
No, I'm totally hearing. I'm totally hearing you. I'm totally agreeing too. By the way.
And I
Yeah.
think it's really central to the whole package that everything goes through nuclear and other warfare kinds of situations. So if we don't handle how we solve our international conflicts,
Yeah.
short of killing each other or trying to maim each other, then we can't do, we can't really accomplish the other things. Might be able to make some progress though.
Yeah.
So,
Well, ironically, you're actually going right to the roots of the international cooperation sector. The entire sector that I work in, its roots came out of that, out of the Second World War. We had just killed, I think, what is it, between 54 and 80 million people on the planet, which puts the virus in perspective some days, right? Just how many people were killed. And what people decided at that point was that the roots of conflict were actually in these disparities and in these differences that we had. And if we could work on those, it's cheaper than war. It's just literally cheaper than war to put money into all the things we need to do to save the planet. And ultimately, that's true today too, because people will say, oh, the sustainable development goals, oh, they're very, very expensive. We'll never get them done. And the bottom line is that you just have to look at the overall budget. I mean, let me give you an example in Canada. I mean, we very quickly in Canada say we cannot afford to be able to spend money on overseas development assistance or working with other countries to make some of the issues that we're facing, like refugee camps or humanitarian assistance. That we said we can't afford that. Now, first of all, Canadians are very, 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 very ignorant about the actual amount. If you ask the average Canadian in a poll, how much money do we spend on that? They'll say that a quarter of the federal dollar, so 25 cents on the dollar, goes to ODA. Now, that's just fundamentally not true. Believe it or not, it's less than a quarter of a penny goes into actually the problems that we're trying to tackle. Now, take the same argument and say, okay, well, where's the money going then? And you realize, oh, no, well, we can quickly increase the military budget in Canada by $70 billion. And the equipment and things that we're buying, like when you look at the actual military apparatus and you go, where's the money come from for that? You realize that there's actually lots of money on our planet. It's where did we focus it? And that's one of our biggest challenges, is that people just fundamentally don't understand the expense of war and how expensive is it to get into a nuclear winter? It's very expensive. If we just wanted to look at it economically and forget the moral side of it, just from an economic perspective, you basically bankrupted the planet instantly for centuries by doing that.
Mhm.
And so the things that you've been working on, the 6 global threats that I see you working on, are absolutely linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. There's no question that it's the same good fight that you've taken up.
I'd be curious about these additional subcategories that you say are so numerous. But I didn't
Yeah, well, they're just targets. Think of it as like each one of the goals will have a sub target that is important. So let's take health and well-being is goal 3.
Mhm.
And under goal 3, I think it's 3.2 or 3. I can't remember which number it is, but there will be the desire for the world to protect itself against infectious diseases.
Mhm.
And you can see that if you don't do that, that was decided in 2015. We had to tackle the key global infectious diseases like malaria or tuberculosis or whatever they happen to be. Well, you can see from the COVID pandemic how important it is to have a global perspective on that issue, because if you don't tackle it together as a world community, then you cannot tackle it as an individual country or even a local community.
Absolutely.
And this is one of the underlying principles that you're talking about the interlinkages. The idea that if you didn't tackle climate change, then you cannot tackle gender equality, or if you don't, or vice versa. Or if you don't tackle gender equality, you fundamentally cannot address, fresh water. Particularly, there's so many examples of this too, that when you see, if you travel or you look around the world and you realize that people will be tackling one subject and not realizing that the deeper root structure of why they can't find the solution is because it's actually lying embedded in another subject. And climate change is a classic. We're all very worried about climate change, but we do have to look at the relationship between climate change and clean energy. For example, goal 7. So that's goal 13 is climate change. Goal 7 is clean energy. Well, if we don't link those two, we fundamentally can't solve one nor the other. And if you don't look at clean energy, then and you don't look at actual justice, then you can't tackle climate justice, which is the idea that some countries have had more access to carbon for a lot longer a period of time, and others need it in order to be able to get the things done that they need to get done.
We don't have 17 different goals, but we do have a platform for survival.
Yeah.
We had people propose planks as if we were a political party, and we were preparing a list of our specific projects that we would try to accomplish. And within, let's say, climate change, there would be several different ways of doing it, including changing the way to sustainable sources of energy, et cetera. And other things like managing carbon sinks so that our forests and our oceans are handled. So all of those are in a way part of this list of 25 planks that take care of all six of the global threats.
Yeah.
And of course, they're really interdependent. And causally too, for example, we have one of our goals is to prevent famine, and another one prevent pandemics, and of course another one to prevent war. Well, these are so related because in a war, famine nowadays has not been caused by shortage of rainfall by and large, not at all. It's caused intentionally as an act of war, where one country lays siege to another one, as in Yemen. They try to starve them to death. So famine is really a weapon of war. And then you say, well, pandemics. In fact, when people are in a famine, they don't usually die of starvation. They're weakened to the point that they're then susceptible to disease. So they actually die of some infectious disease that becomes an epidemic in the area. So all three of these are completely interrelated.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we talk about global warming. As sure enough, when we have global warming really drying up the planet and so on, and causing floods and so on, that's going to cause food shortage. So we'll have famines again caused by, climate and so on. So I think these are so connected. You say that your group has been working on looking at the whole package as a system. What you got a document or something? Tell me about that document. I talk too much. I'm sorry.
No. I wanted to ask you a question that gets asked of me a lot when it comes to the interlinkages, and it's just simply, which one of these do we work on? Because you have only so much energy in a day, and if you know that they're all linked, then should you work on issues of famine, or should you work on nuclear proliferation? Should you work on nuclear bombs or nuclear energy, or should you work on clean energy? Because you could go out all day and work on promoting solar power, for example, and you don't have enough time at the end of the day to also work on gender equality. So one of the questions I get asked a lot is, which one of these do you work on, given that they are all interlinked? I'm kind of curious in your case.
Well, my answer is everybody is already working on all of them to some degree. The problem is that we work on them in silos. Right. And people working on famine don't know that they're on the same team as people working on pandemics or people working on war, et cetera. We don't think that we're all in a common project, but we think sometimes we get to thinking that we're competing with each other for resources. Yeah. Now that's stupid, because everybody's on the same team if we just get acquainted. I think that's what we need to do, is recognize that all of these are teams that are maybe specialists, but also there's a general overview that needs to be emphasized, that all of these are, we're in the business of saving the world.
Yeah. Well, here's some good news for you that you'll like this, because what we did is we wanted to find out who's on that team that you're talking about. And so we went around to 32 communities in British Columbia. We drove around and visited every single one, and we sat down with all of the leaders in each of those communities in roundtables to understand who in their community is working on which of these problems. And that might, of the 17 goals. And then we started to realize, wow, there's actually like every single community, if you sat down and did this exercise of community mapping on the wall, every single one of them would stand back at the end of the evening and go, wow, we're covering every single one of these goals. There's somebody in our community working on every single one of these things, almost every time, and sometimes many different groups in each one of those goals. So, what we did is we actually created a digital map. It's called the Movement Map. You can find it on our website, or just Google Movement Map. And you're going to find a picture there of the Team Canada that you're talking about. But guess how many groups are working on the SDGs? You're not going to believe this. We had no idea. But okay, it's hard to guess. I'm just going to tell you. I think there's 12,800 groups.
My God.
Does that cheer up your day or what? Like that? You see, we tend to think that we're just a small group working in a church basement or something. But if you take all those church basements and all those groups together and you put them all on a map, and you realize, wow, there's a group in Quesnel, there's a group in Smithers, there's a group in Guelph, there's tons of groups in Toronto. And so you can find out where they all are, and you can find out what they're working on, and you realize we're covering every single part of the planet.
But how do you find them? How do you find them?
Oh, it was hard. Two to 3 years of work.
We need one mailing list, that has the contact for all of these people. And we've got...
It's there. No, it's already there. It's already on the map. You can go there right now and get it. Yeah, it's quite amazing. Like, you can go in and just click in. I want to look up who's working on goal 16 peace. Bang. You'll find every single community listed, every single group. You'll find their webpage, their organizations, their phone numbers. Well, it was a lot of work. We sat down with a bunch of mappers, young volunteers at first, eventually got a little bit of money to pay them. But basically, a bunch of people, very clever people, sat down and they went through all of the databases of the nonprofits, checked their websites, and then went through to figure out which SDG they're working on and which of the sub-targets they're working on and which of the indicators they're working on. And it's all been mapped. So we have, for the first time ever in Canada, and we're the only country in the world that's done it. So now Germany is trying to follow what we're doing. There's a bunch of people in Latin America and Africa. We've just mapped in Minnesota 800 groups just in the state of Minnesota. So the map's going kind of international, because the idea is if we could figure out, see, up until now, Meta, we've known what we need to do, and we have 1,000 theories on how to do it. But the one question nobody ever asked was, well, who's doing it already? Because there's an impression that we have to start this from scratch. But you know that you've been working, how long have you been working on peace issues? Let me ask you that. How long have you?
Well, let's see. In the 40s, I was, look, I'm going to be 90 in a few months.
Wow. You're going to party?
I'm going to be 90. So yes, I was interested in the 40s.
See,
but up
there
and
you
down,
go.
there have been times when I did more navel gazing than I did activism. So I can't really tell you a good straight answer. But I suppose...
But it's been a while. You've been working on, it's not like you just started.
I was during the Vietnam War. I remember marching in San Francisco, carrying my son piggyback in demonstrations. So,
Wow.
Okay.
You're Meta, you're reminding me of a film I shot years ago for The Voice of Women. And I interviewed a woman, and she was in her 90s, and she had been a peace activist, and she started listing the wars. And she went through every war as to how she had been a peace activist. And then there was this kind of silent moment where she kind of just lost herself in one of those wars in a moment of memory. It was a very emotional stage in the film, because one realizes, this is something I say to young activists all the time. I say, I'm not really so concerned that you stay in our movement, in our organization, or in our network. What the dream is that when you're 90, like you, that you're still going. That's the dream, because one has to realize that we don't, even with the SDGs, the idea is we're going to get to 2030, but I promise you, when we get to 2030, we will not be living in a utopian perfect planet. It's just not going to happen. So the question is, how do we stay active? How do we stay engaged with the world, caring about it enough that we're going to be able to see that this isn't a fight that stops tomorrow. This is one that will continue forever.
Well, actually, I think in any life cycle, there are periods when people become less active because they're on the ladder. They've got to, get their credentials and, their CV looking good. And then the best time, and I think young people they're changing all the time, so you can't really expect them to stay on track. But the beauty is when they get to be 65, that's the time to recruit them, because they're
Right.
just retiring and they have a lot of free time and they're still smart. They know a lot of stuff and they're ready to go.
And they
So
have tremendous
65 is a
experience.
great
Yeah.
time to become an activist again. And a lot of people do.
Here's a thought too, because you see, I work with a lot of young people. We send a lot of young people to the climate change meetings. I think British Columbia Council has like the largest youth delegations to go to the high level political forums of the UN and the climate change. We're the only group that sends massive numbers of youth. Now, here's the thing. So I'm a youth advocate, but you know what the youth are telling us these days when we do these roundtables? They're saying that what they want is not to be isolated as youth, but to be working intergenerationally. And therein lies a whole new way of seeing the world.
I
I
think
find
that's
that very
different.
exciting.
I think that
Pardon?
if you're hearing that, I think that's a change.
It
In
is a
my
change.
experience, when I'm thinking, for example, of the Iraq War, when I was still teaching, all of a sudden, I was at the Mississauga campus at U of T, and all of a sudden, I had a little workshop room where we did peace studies,
Mm-hmm.
resource center with a lot of documents and things like that. I had two rooms, and it was be filled up at noon with all of the students coming in wanting. And the lovely thing was, it was their project. It wasn't mine. They were excited about it and engaged with it. So I have the feeling, I have always had the feeling that when young people do something, it's at a time when they're trying to become independent more and they want to do it on their own. And it's not easy to recruit young people into old people's organizations.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying now they want to do more generationally, then I think that may be a new phenomenon, because
You know
that's
why I think it's new? Yeah, it is a new phenomenon. I think there's a reason why it's new, because if we look at how the movements in the 60s, there was a lot of anti-establishment, anti-system. It was a fight against the system, right? And it was a fight against how things had been. And if we also look at the demographic wave at that point, there was a strong baby boom generation that really led that alternative way of thinking. But what we have now is sort of different in the sense that we're very globally interconnected, and we're also facing challenges that everybody knows. Every single generation knows that nobody represents the problem there. We're collectively the problem. Climate change, every single one of us is involved in driving cars and and the modern economy. And we can see that actually collectively we're sitting in a problem that nobody knows the answer to. Therefore, we were going to have to think together. There's a lot of talk around this called wicked problem solving. The idea that the problem is so wicked that no one perspective is going to be able to solve this one. So you can't stand up as a youth and go, well, I know how to do it, because you actually don't. And nobody in the older generation can say, this is how we've always done it, and this is how it should be. That was the 1950s or 60s fight. Today, we're sitting in the year 2021. We have all these different perspectives, global perspectives, multiple generation perspectives. And we're for the first time ever realizing, wow, if we don't put all these together and be inclusive of who is at the table, then we fundamentally aren't going to solve this one. And so you're seeing kind of a little bit more humility in terms of people realizing, no, we're going to need, for example, your experience. You say you're turning 90. We need the intergenerational experience, because there's the young folks that come along, they never went through a war. They don't understand what was the felt sense of Vietnam all about. And so that's something at my age that I'm kind of between you and the young folks. I'm 56.
Boy, I really want to work more closely with you guys, because I didn't realize that you had done this spectacular. I can hardly imagine collecting 12,000 names of organizations. Do you have like a file for every one of them, or how do you?
No, to be honest, it was hard to collect them, but it's even harder to maintain those numbers. So what we've done is we've encouraged people. So for example, if a person is watching this program and they're not on the map, forgive us. It's because of the way that we did the searches using known databases from each provincial government may or may not share. And then in the end, they all shared. So it was really good. We got all the databases, and then for the first time ever went through them, categorized them, and figured out which groups are actually working on the SDGs. Once you've done that, groups change. right? Addresses change, and that's the challenge, is to keep the database up to date. So we're still kind of working on trying to maintain that. In the meantime, what it does serve is that it's a very inspirational place to find out who is doing what. So if you wanted to know, let's say tomorrow there's a, I don't know, there's a tidal wave in Indonesia, like happened a few years ago, and you really feel concerned and you want to find a group that's working in that area and has been working on the ground. Because this is the key thing about the map, you see, is that what it's stating, when you see the map, you realize, oh my gosh, there's 12,600 groups and they've all been working on this. And some people have been working on this for 30, 40 years. You realize we're not starting from scratch with the SDGs. We really aren't. And, this will give you a kudo too, because, to be honest, when I look back at the 80s and I look back at my own involvement in the anti-nuclear movement back when I was a young student and so on, I actually credit your generation for keeping this planet alive. Honestly, I do. Because I believe that if the people, the Helen Caldecotts and the people who stood up during those years and brought our attention to the idea that we could annihilate ourselves on this planet, those are the same giants upon whose shoulders we're standing today. Same in the environmental movement. You go back and you look at the people that drew our attention to the idea that we're polluting this place. They were polluting the very place that we live. All of those people that kept that story alive, that narrative alive, they can all be seen now on this map. There's 12,500 groups. There's hundreds of thousands of people involved in that, behind the map. And you realize that it's actually a living story, that the fact that we're still alive, the fact you and I are having this conversation, we haven't been blown up, the fact that we're still somehow limping through COVID on the planet. Yes, there's a lot of wars, there's a lot of things going on, but somehow through this, we're still going. And that to me is that's not what's the word? That's not like, there's a reason. That's what I'm trying to get at. Like, if there was nuclear buttons that people could have pushed, they would have pushed them, but somehow we stopped it. And that's where I just want to, say to you and your generation, because you're a different generation than mine, is that you serve to keep my generation alive. And I hope in my work to serve to keep the next generation alive, so that my 8-year-old daughter kind of makes it through this. Right. And in there, what I'm loving is that all these generations now are coming together, and we're seeing the global discourse. The common global discourse now is the SDGs. It is peace. It is a way to move forward. And I see a lot of hope in that. Like, there's a lot of reasons not to be hopeful when you do what we do, but there's a lot of reasons also to realize we're still going. I mean, it's kind of amazing.
Yeah. It's the best of times and the worst of times. In some ways, the risk is greater than ever. I mean, I talk to people about things like methane leaks in the Arctic. And, nobody knows anything about that, but, that may be the most dangerous thing facing humankind right now. It could be an extinction event. And people are just not quite sure how serious it is. They have to work it out.
Yeah.
But clearly.
Actually, I was just going to say, how people don't realize how dangerous methane is. 80 times, I think it's 83 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than CO2. So when you release a little bit of methane, it has the impact of 80 times as much carbon. And then what you're talking about, which is the release in the Arctic, has sat as a nightmare amongst climate change scientists for some time, because it points to what they call a tipping point in climate change, where if it were to release quickly and fast, it can fundamentally go from being like a slow exponential curve to a sudden dramatic rise. It's what they call the toilet bowl scenario. And that toilet bowl scenario sits as it's the same one that worries scientists about the oceans and the acidification of the oceans, is that we may hit a point of acidification where it just toilet bowls on us. Yeah. All those things are sitting there. Actually, I'm curious. You've seen a lot, right? I mean, you mentioned the number of wars and crises, and you said we're at a particular point. I'm curious how you view, with your experience, how do you view the year 2021? Like, do you think we're just still climbing like that, or do you see tipping points happening?
Well, look, I mean, different people, it depends on who you talk to. Tomorrow, I will talk to a guy who's very optimistic. Is it tomorrow? Yes, later this week. One guy is very optimistic that, yes, we're going to stay within 2 degrees. And that's the crucial thing from his point of view, because all he thinks that we need to do is reduce carbon emissions. And I think that's not true. I think we've got to actually suck it out of the existing atmosphere and put it away. So I think that we don't, I'm not going to challenge him particularly because that's one point of view. Then there are others who are really alarmed about the possibility that any moment there could be an explosion of methane from under the seabed. And
Mhm.
he figured, he said something like 8%, if 8% of what we think is there should come out at once, it would raise the atmospheric temperature by 1.4 degrees centigrade, which then would warm it enough so that the rest of the 92% would, and it would be game over for all kinds of, not just people. Okay, so there's the global warming threat, which
Yeah.
is just terrible, and the nuclear threat is sustaining itself. You know, they keep modernizing nuclear weapons, and people have no idea how risky it is that could be accidentally
Yeah.
initiated.
Yeah.
So the people like Bill Perry, who was probably the most knowledgeable person about nuclear weapons on the planet because he was Secretary of Defense for a lifetime practically.
Yeah.
And he says that we're in much worse shape now, much greater risk than we were during the Cold War of nuclear war.
I
And
know, isn't that crazy?
so
Yeah.
here you have these two catastrophes, and yet you can see all of these opportunities and all of the ways in which we're really on the verge of really, really making some progress. So,
I view it, yeah, I view this very existentially because I think that we have, like, if you can see a technological threat like nuclear weapons, and you can see how technology itself can be so pathologically dangerous. But then look, we're in a Zoom conversation right now where we can converse about these subjects, and people are doing it all over the place right now to change minds and attitudes, and it's happening at lightning speed. Why? Because technology has allowed us at the same way to do this. So there's a balance going on here between not just technologically, but also sort of ethically in the conversations that we're having, because 50 to 100 years ago, we would have talked about conquering nation states in the Westphalian system. And nobody would have even hesitated to talk like that. Now, you couldn't get away with talking like that. You just fundamentally can't. Right.
yeah,
And so
there are people who do. And I guess I would, in a way, disagree with you to the extent of saying that, yes, this technology is wonderful, but it's also being used by crazies.
It's being used by crazies, but it's being used by saints at the same time. And this is the part that's interesting to look at, is to go, well, I don't have as much historical perspective as you do, which is why I think it's interesting to ask you, do you think, because that balance has always been there, otherwise we'd be dead, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is the bottom line. Are we in balance right now, or do you see tipping points in one direction or the other? And this is something that I think is an interesting thing is particularly talking to young people, because the amount of dejection and sort of hopelessness about climate change is overwhelming. It's the same feeling that people had in the 80s when they thought they were going to get blown up with the 2-minute atomic clock. Do you remember that? The feeling that maybe you're going to die at any minute?
Well, look, you made a video that I saw where you talked about celebrating hopelessness. I never feel hopeless because I don't work on, my energy doesn't come from hope. It comes from a sense of duty. That if I know that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and that, of course, I'm never really sure, but I'm pretty sure sometimes that this is something I should be doing. And if I think I'm supposed to be doing this, and I know it's not going to work, but I still think I should do it, I'll keep doing it. So that never throws me in that sense. But I think you're also pointing at the worst threat of all, which is the tendency that people have to deny catastrophes, the potential for catastrophes. And one of the things that disaster researchers in sociology find is that it's very universal, that if you warn people that there's a disaster coming, let's say you go around the street with a bullhorn in your car saying, run for your lives because there's a high dam that's about to break.
Yeah.
People will just, forget it. Don't. They won't do it. You can't get people to respond to the warnings about disasters.
Yeah.
So this thing about denying scary things is a very widespread phenomenon. And that is what is is the energy behind people who on the right, who will, the Trump people, or the people who simply are more concerned about going backward in time, making America great again, or Russia great again, or Brazil great again, or
Yeah.
something, as if all you have to do is go back to the way it used to be and you'd be great. Well,
Yeah.
that's because they are denying the threat that we actually are facing. And how do you overcome that? That, I think, is the worst problem of all. Do you have a theory? Because I'm going to be talking to a guy later this week on that very topic.
Yeah.
Denial of, well, uh, trying to convince people that there's a real threat when they don't want to believe there is. What do you do?
Yeah. Well, you brought. Can I just ask you one question first? Because said something that's very, very important, which is that you get your energy. You said your underlying source of energy is around duty, a sense of duty. And I'm curious, it's duty. So when you think of yourself and you're in duty to what? What is that? And where does the energy come from? Because sourcing these energies to be social activists over time, like if I said to somebody, look, I want you to be able to get to the age of 90 and still be doing social activism like this friend I met named Meta. And they'll say, well, how am I going to do that? Well, I'd say source the energy of duty. But what would it mean? Like, how would you explain that to
I guess
somebody so they can understand?
the source that most touched me at a certain moment of my life was reading a book by Viktor Frankl, which was then titled From Death Camp to Existentialism. I think they retitled it something like Man's Search for Meaning. And he describes being in a death camp, Nazi concentration camp where most of the people were going to die. And he talks about giving meaning, trying to help the other people around him find the meaning in their lives. And it's like his notion, he doesn't talk about God gives you assignments. He doesn't use that language. He just says life. Life gives you assignments to do. And you have to be on your toes to look at what your current assignment is that you're being told this is what you're supposed to be doing. And of course, there's a danger, I think, in that. He doesn't talk about the danger, but I think the danger is that crazy people believe that God's telling them things to do. And, that's just part of being psychotic, I gather, mentally ill. So, if I feel I have a duty to be doing something, which I do right now, this is my duty to be doing this show with you.
Yeah.
This is it. There's a possibility that I could be kidding myself, that I could be deluding myself and so on. And so I have to be a little humble about talking about God told me to do this or life told me to do this. But I think whether you say it's God telling you to do it or life is presenting you with certain challenges, that it's quite possible to deny them and ignore them. You have to actually intend to be looking. I think to find them.
Yeah, you do have to be searching.
Your question, I'm not sure I've answered.
No, you have. Bringing up Viktor Frankl is so interesting because actually he was a trained psychoanalyst, and what's interesting about his work because he was working with people in the middle of a horrifying, I would say, the historically over our entire planet and our entire history, there is nothing more horrifying than the Holocaust. And what he tuned into in that context was that people are not essentially we're not essentially oriented towards happiness. We're essentially oriented towards meaning. And what you are describing right now is that essential core. And it shows up in so many perennial philosophies. I mean, and shows up in so many different religions and so many different spiritual paths, is that ultimately when we sense into who we are and what are we trying to do, how are we trying to show up in this brief life that we have on our planet in this context, there is an enormous amount of orientation towards meaning, and not necessarily money and happiness and a new RV and a new car. Ultimately, we all know that if we go through that, there's something else going on. Now, here's what I think is interesting, is it's actually expressed in the development of an adult human being. Kids go through a stage where they're pretty centered towards themselves. They're egocentrically oriented. They just want their food and their cookies and so on. But eventually, they'll reach out and they'll realize, okay, I got this sort of other boundary around me, my group, my family, and so on, right? But if you look at the later stages of this, you'll see that people grow and see that and they start to embrace wider and wider senses of care about who they care about. So they go beyond even their family, or even beyond, ultimately beyond their species, and they start caring about the earth and the planet and the trees. Now, what's going on in that development of the care structure goes right back to what you're talking about, which is a sense of self towards other and duty towards other. But ultimately, if we examine that, we would see that we actually start to identify as other. This is the critical leap, is that you start to realize, I am an expression of the interconnected web of life. Therefore, I do care about that jungle, not because it's a jungle far away in another country, because that jungle is me. This is how we manifested together, right? So and this interestingly shows up in every mystical tradition, going right back to Meister Eckhart or any of the ones you want to name. They all go back and they all start to clue into the same sense of a duty or a calling, because they identify with, not as or against, but with. And this is something I find intriguing, because that sense is more and more being articulated in the global discourse. And when I said you wouldn't get away with it today to talk about the nation state, I mean, if you went to the United Nations right now and you tried to talk as a nation state and you tried to ignore the global discourse of the SDGs, you would ultimately fail. 193 nations signed that thing 5 years ago, and it fundamentally, as an orientation, talks about all of us on a planet with no planet B. And ultimately, I'm ranting a bit here, but ultimately, this is at the core of the human experience, is to show up like you're doing. I mean, good on you for doing that. You do this every day. You talk to people and you show up and you stay active. And when I see your life and what you're doing, there's no question that there's hope. There's absolutely no question.
Well, I take the same kind of encouragement from what you're doing too, because, I didn't know you. And thank God you've got a good, energetic sister. Boy, she's dynamite.
Yeah, she's a lot of fun, eh?
Yeah, she told me how to meet my brother.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that we made this connection today. And I have to say, good on you. I'll try and promote your channel so that people can see the grassroots. By the way, what you're doing is really intriguing, because what you've done here is kind of the new form of democracy, which I find very exciting too, is that people are able to get on a YouTube channel, have these kinds of conversations. No, it's not broadcast to the entire world. We're not on CNN, but we can have the conversations that need to happen because they wouldn't happen on CNN. Do you see what I'm getting at? Like, there's no room for these kinds of conversations, but these are the critical conversations that people at the community grassroots level want to have. And what I get excited about is that, when I talked about the map, 12,500, imagine if there's 12,500 conversations like this going on. It's unstoppable, that force. So the technology is there, the people are there, and I would encourage anybody who's watching you to get inspired and do what you're doing.
It's a matter of getting aware of each other as partners.
Yeah.
It's just, I just love you already,
Me too. There you go. Yeah.
So, we just have to get aware of each other, because there are a lot of folks like you out there.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a good thing, is there's no shortage of people. It's right. Connecting them. I think that's why I got into networking, because you can connect them. If you can connect them and realize there's no shortage. I
am very enthusiastic about networks as opposed to another organization. Yeah. I don't want to form another organization. There are 12,000 of them, it looks like. Yeah. But what we needed, I thought, was a web page where people could come and share ideas and be aware of what all of these other people are thinking about and doing. Yeah. So we have this one web page called tosavetheworld.ca, and people can go there and post their ideas and share, like a listserv or something like that.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's awesome.
Okay, how can I work better with you? Because if you're doing this, if you're in BC, but this SDG thing is really what we need to all be focusing on right now.
Yeah. Well, you know what I say when people say, how can I get involved? I usually say, well, how are you already involved? And can you build on your current involvement? Because everybody comes to these subjects with an expertise. They might have been a teacher. They might, who knows what they've done? Maybe they've been an engineer or something, right? But your life has led up to this point and you have created yourself as the extraordinary person that you are. And then the question is, how can you launch from that into
Mhm.
just simply connecting? That's the trick, is to no longer be in isolation, but to connect. And if you can connect with another person, and the connection points, that's where networks are great. You can go to an organization, connect with an organization. If that doesn't work for you, you want to have a broader view, connect with a network. And there are networks you can connect. Anybody can become an individual member of our network, but there's other networks. I never want to promote just one. There's peace networks. There's your network, Save the World. The key thing here is to make the leap. The key thing here is to say, okay, I'm no longer going to work. We're going to exist as me, as myself. I'm no longer going to show up alone. I'm going to show up in with other people. So my special sort of nature is going to leap in, and I'm going to work with others in a kind of a unified way. And there's a lot of conflict in that. There's a lot of trouble in that, but that it's also the answer. It's the answer to how we're going to solve some of the problems. And this is where I get back to this idea too, that we don't just go in with the group that you've always gone in with or the people you've always gone in with. If there's a way you can make the leap and be in with other groups and other ways of thinking, that's the big message we're getting today about inclusivity and about having a lot of different people at the table from a lot of different backgrounds. And particularly what we talk about in the SDGs is the concept of, and it's very deep in the principles of the SDGs, is the concept of leave no one behind. And by that, there's a lot of problems with that, how it's phrased, but the idea is that there are people that never get to the table, that never get to be involved in conversations. And can we reach them? Get involved in the way that makes you, where your passion shows up. And then just take that passion and connect it to this idea that you've come up with, which is that if you're working on climate change and that's your passion, just be able to see the link to peace. Mm-hmm. Instead of seeing it as you're doing your silo and they're doing their silo, just make that leap, which is, wow, if I'm working on climate change and I tackle the justice nature of climate change, or if I can see the link between climate change and war, which is so obvious in places like Syria and so on, if I can make those links, then I'm now thinking with this global mindset that you're talking about interlinkages. It's the big leap in my mind. It's the 2015 to 2020 will go down in history as the period in time where we started to make the leap. And if we can make the leap by 2030.
Well, how people are monitoring progress and what are the next stages? I mean, I heard about the launch of the SDGs, and
yeah,
but I'm not sure how. Is there a process of evaluating how we're doing and what it's going to be like when we finish it, et cetera? What's going on organizationally?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because, it lay at the heart of the SDGs as well, which was that people were getting pretty tired of people going to the United Nations making fantastic statements about what they're going to do, mm-hmm. and then not being held accountable. Mm-hmm. And so the accountability side of it was that if you're going to say we're going to eradicate poverty, what are the numbers? And this is where we realize, so there's 169 sub-targets, 17 goals, but there's actually, I think it's 241 indicators of success.
And they tick off measurements.
Yeah, like, let me give you an example. Like, if you're showing up on poverty, we know an indicator for a country that it is showing up and trying to help on the whole issue of international development would be that you spend 0.7% of your gross national income, GNI, on ODA. So that's an indicator, very specific, very targeted, very specific indicator. You can measure it. Every country can show up, report. Same thing with, let's take the national indicators for contributions on climate change. We know what they are. Everybody agreed in Paris. This is what the INDCs will need to be. The national indicators, and every country puts forward their commitments, like Canada. Now we can measure ourselves against progress on goal 13. And each of the goals has these.
How often do they submit reports?
Every country has to submit at least 2 reports. Canada has submitted 1 report. Many countries are on their 3rd report already. And this is all done every summer. The countries come together at a meeting called the High Level Political Forum, and people compare notes as to how are we doing on the planet? How are we doing on these SDGs? How far do we have to go? How far have we come? That's the big question. And we can see on progress on the SDGs that we have fallen behind. Now, COVID has made us fall even further behind on some. Like on poverty, I think we needed to get 800 million people out of extreme poverty in 800 weeks when we started the SDGs. Imagine, that's a huge number of people. It's almost 1 billion. By the way, it's nothing even close. Just to be optimistic, it's nothing even close to what we faced in the 1990s. I mean, we had was almost, I can't remember the exact number, but it's multiple fold numbers more people that were living in extreme poverty. So we've really brought poverty down, 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 down in an extraordinary way since the 1990s. And now we had about 800 million left. Well, we were doing pretty good. We were tackling it through 2015, but then along came COVID, and we're back. I think the World Bank just released a report saying that we're back by 100 million. So we've gone backwards because part of the COVID has smashed economies around the world. So we know that. So we can see the progress and the numbers, and we can see the indicators. And this is another thing that your viewers fundamentally need to understand, is that we are not actually falling behind on some. We're actually gaining ground. Like we've gained huge ground on, for example, literacy for the girl child. Access to education is a fundamentally different picture on the planet than it was in 1992.
And that's so crucial for global warming. You know, that is one of the big factors reducing over time. Yeah. Okay.
So you brought up this idea of, well, like, how do we measure it? And this is where I just to put some we can measure it. There's a lot of the indicators that we still don't have the ability to measure. So it creates a big problem, right? But I will say that if you do look at some of the measurements, you can see that we're gaining and we're losing, and we have to look at why are we gaining, why are we losing, and how do we fight this good fight that we're in on the planet. So anybody could get involved and look at the indicators, and we ourselves put out what's called a shadow report. So the government puts out a report, and then along comes civil society, and we actually look at all the statistics and we look behind it and we go, well, actually, wait a second, here's another story. And so then we put out what's called a shadow report. And the shadow report we bring and we publish and we talk to the government about. And I think we've produced about 5 of those right now, or 4.
Oh, yeah. Your organization, BCIC, is that what it's?
BC's the British Columbia Council for International Cooperation, and the webpage is bccic.ca. And on there, if you look, you'll find the SDGs and you'll find all the reports. Yes. And we put out a report on Canada. In fact, we have a report called Keeping Score, which is all about the indicator framework to understand how's Canada doing on measuring our progress. Are we doing a good job or not? And there's another interview you could think of in the next few weeks. The Auditor General will put out a spring report. The Canadian Auditor General will put out a spring report through the Environmental Commissioner's Office on Canada's progress on the SDGs. And I look forward to understanding whether we did very well or not. Because when they first came along, they put out a report, the auditor put out a report to say, okay, well, the Canadian government made all these promises at the UN. Are we doing anything? And they found that on 7 points of preparedness, Canada had fallen far, far behind other countries. And actually, this is the sad story of being Canadian, to be honest, is that other countries have taken the SDGs very, very seriously. They're taking it very seriously. In Canada,
and Canada has less so. Oh, that's so.
No, the Canadian story, unfortunately, is a bit sad. It's a good story about civil society. Like I said, lots of groups involved, lots of groups doing the work. Unfortunately, the Canadian government has actually fallen behind on this one, quite dramatically, actually.
Well, we got to pull up our socks.
So got to pull up our socks.
Exactly. You say be hopeless, and I say no.
Actually, no, I never said be hopeless. This is very interesting. I did talk about that, but I always said to see both sides, because if you can hold hope and you can understand that hopelessness tells us a lot. Like if you look at climate change, it looks pretty hopeless, but that can be motivating, right? So you have to be hopeful. I will never said don't be hopeless. Always be hopeful as you are, as hopeful as I am right now. Honestly, got to hold hope.
This has been exactly the most energizing conversation I've had in a long time.
Oh, so good.
I feel ready to go. How about?
All right. Well, let's get on. You have a good day, Meta. It's such a pleasure to talk to you.
Wonderful.
I'll be
back in touch with you sometime. Thanks.
Very inspiring. Bye. All right. Bye-bye.